What's going on, everybody? Kalipis Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, I'm going to be giving you my full review of the BLU F92e 5G to help you decide whether or not it's the right phone for you. Now, as always, if you do end up wanting to learn more about this phone, definitely check out the description where I will be linking to several other videos about it, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. Now, the BLU F92e 5G is a really affordable entry-level 5G phone, but despite a relatively small price tag of only $149, for what it is, it does have quite a bit to offer. For the display, we're getting a 6.5-inch IPS LCD display with a 720p resolution, a PPI of 270, and a 20:9 aspect ratio. So on one hand, definitely not the most amazing, impressive specs ever, but despite this, I do think we are getting a pretty nice display here. At 6.5 inches, it is decently large, so if you're doing stuff like watching videos, browsing the web, using social media, pretty much anything you can think of, things will be decently easy to see. And with a 20:9 aspect ratio, we're getting a pretty tall and narrow form factor. So if you're in landscape mode doing something like watching videos or looking at photos, you're gonna get a nice immersive experience. Things are going to look really good in general, so as you can see, when you zoom all the way in, things are pretty cinematic looking, which again is definitely great for watching videos, or maybe if you're playing a game or something like that. And then say you're maybe browsing the web or using social media. With a form factor like this, if you're doing any kind of scrolling, you'll be able to fit a decent amount of content on the screen without having to scroll too much. And then when it comes to the image quality, despite only having a 720p resolution, first of all, the colors and brightness do look really good. And despite only having a 720p resolution, things definitely don't look that bad. I mean, it's decently sharp for what it is. So of course, on one hand, if you're really watching videos all day and doing that kind of stuff, you might want to get something that has a 1080p resolution instead. But honestly, for the average user, if you're more of a casual content consumer, whatever you want to call it, with this display in pretty much every way, you will get a pretty decent experience. Now for storage, with the BLU F92e 5G, we're getting 128GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, and honestly, I feel like this is probably the most impressive thing about this phone. Keep in mind, again, this phone retails for $149, and depending on whatever deals and promotions are going on at the time you're watching this, you might get it for even less. So considering this, getting an entire 128GB of internal storage is definitely impressive, and keep in mind, in this price range, while I want to say that average is around 64. There are several phones in this price range, like the Motorola Moto G Play 2023 for example, that only have 32GB. So in general, if you are looking for a really entry-level phone that has a ton of storage, the BLU F92e 5G is going to be a great choice. Now for security features, this phone does have Face Unlock and a fingerprint scanner right here on the power key, so definitely nice to get both options here. But let's go ahead and give the fingerprint scanner a try. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So as you can see, real fast and responsive, no issues at all. And again, this phone does have Face Unlock too, so if you want to use that instead, you always can. Now taking a look at the camera setup here, with the BLU F92e 5G, up front, we got a pretty generic looking water drop notch design for the front facing camera. Definitely doesn't look bad, but in this price range, pretty much every front facing camera looks essentially the same. And this camera is 13 megapixels. In general, when it comes to the actual selfie camera quality, I would say it's pretty decent. As you can see here, portrait mode works really well. Sure, the colors aren't super bright and vibrant and the details aren't quite as sharp as maybe a more expensive phone, but in general, for taking the occasional selfie here and there, it will definitely get the job done. Then on the back, we got a triple camera setup with a 50 megapixel main camera, a 2 megapixel macro camera, and a 0.3 megapixel depth sensing camera. Now, one thing I do want to point out here when it comes to features is that on BLU's website, they do say this phone does have an ultra-wide camera, but for the life of me, I can't find it. I mean, if we go to the camera app, in pretty much every phone I've ever seen, there's either a button here to turn on the ultra-wide camera, or you just tap the 1x. And as you can see, that does not open an ultra-wide camera. And when it comes to the angle you would expect from an ultra-wide camera, this is definitely not it. So maybe the feature is hidden in there somewhere, but if I as a tech reviewer can't find it, that really goes to show if the feature even is here. It's definitely not user-friendly at all. So in general, if you do want to get those wider angle photos, then you're probably going to want to get a different phone. But aside from that, the other camera features on this phone are actually pretty good. With a 50 megapixel main camera, this phone definitely takes some real good normal photos. So no matter what you're doing for the average user, I do think the camera quality with this phone is definitely going to be plenty good enough. To give you an idea of what it can do, here's some pictures taken with the main camera of the BLU F92e 5G. Keep in mind, I was using the full 50 megapixels when I took these photos, which it doesn't do by default. In case you're wondering how to do that, definitely check out my camera tips and tricks video where I go over it. But essentially, at the full 50 megapixels, everything does look really good, and it really just goes to show that if you want to take nice photos for like Instagram, for example, or whatever else you might be doing, you really don't have to spend $1,000 on a flagship phone, or even $500 on a mid-range phone, depending on your expectations. expectations. You can simply get an entry-level phone like this that has a pretty good camera, and in most situations, it will get the job done. I mean, if you posted a picture like this on Instagram, I'm pretty sure it would blend in with everything else just fine. So at the end of the day, if you're maybe not really serious about mobile photography per se, but you still want to get some nice photos every now and then I do think the camera we're getting with this phone is going to be perfectly fine for you. And then when it comes to video, with the BLU F92e 5G, this phone has a max recording quality of 2K in the rear camera and then 1080p in the front. So while 2K in my opinion isn't really a game changer or anything, compared to most other phones in this price range, typically the norm is to max out at like 1080p. So being able to record in 2K, at least in the rear camera, definitely gives this phone a bit of an edge. And as for the video quality itself, I do think it is pretty good. Sure, it's not like amazing vlog YouTube quality depending on what your expectations are, but if you are recording the occasional video every now and then, maybe you like to make a lot of TikToks, something on social media like Snapchat, or simply just stuff to send to friends and family, no matter what you're doing in general, as long as you're not really looking for super professional quality, I do think the video quality on the BLU F92e 5G is going to be perfectly fine for the average user. Now, when it comes to RAM and processor, with the BLU F92e 5G, we're getting 4GB of RAM with the MediaTek Dimensity 700 processor. Now, I've seen this processor in all kinds of different phones, and I'm definitely not complaining because for what it is, this processor is actually really good. With this phone, the performance is going to be plenty good enough for most kinds of activities, whether you're doing casual stuff like online shopping, sending text messages, browsing the web, and maybe watching an occasional video every now and then, or you're doing stuff like social media, mobile gaming. As long as you're not really on your phone all day doing super demanding activities, the performance we're getting with the BLU F92e 5G is definitely going to be fast enough to at least give you a pretty good experience. Now, that being said though, if you are more of a power user and you're really coming from something that's maybe like a refurbished flagship phone or something like that that's a bit older but also pretty powerful, you might be disappointed because compared to something like a Samsung Galaxy S10 for example, the BLU F92e 5G, being a really entry-level 5G phone, is not nearly as fast, but compared to the average entry-level phone in this same price range, the performance we're getting here is definitely at least decently impressive. Now, I did run a benchmark test on this phone using Geekbench 5, and here are the results I got. So as always, what I recommend doing is running this test on your current phone, and then comparing your results to these, and that's going to give you a better idea of where this phone stands performance-wise compared to your current device. But overall, again, I feel like for the average user, as long as you're not really using your phone all the time, and you have decently reasonable expectations, I do think this phone, while not being super fast, is at least going to be fast enough for most people. And then of course, this kind of goes without saying, but the BLU F92e 5G is in fact a 5G phone, and this really just goes to show that although you can technically get by with a 4G phone, at this point in 2023, you can even get a 5G phone for less than $150, and that's not counting carrier deals and stuff like that. So if you really want 5G connectivity, if you want access to your carrier's latest and greatest network, all that, then nowadays, it's really more accessible than ever. And honestly, if you get a 4G phone, you're really not saving that much money anymore. Now, the BLU F92e 5G really has a great battery with a 5000 mAh battery supporting 10-watt fast charging. So while the fast charging really isn't the best out there, in my experience, the charging speeds are at least acceptable. So as long as you're not expecting your phone to charge lightning fast or anything, you should at least get by. And then of course, with a 5000 mAh battery, that's definitely a really large battery. So if battery life is more of a priority for you, then this phone is going to be a great choice. Now, as far as software goes, with the BLU F92e 5G, this phone does have Android 12, which honestly I guess is okay, but at the same time, we are in 2023 and we are on Android 13, so it would have been nice to see a phone that was launched this year actually have the latest version of Android, but I guess for BLU that's too much to ask. So if you do want the latest version of Android, then you are going to want to get something else. But at this point, not that many phones in this price range that aren't Samsung's have Android 13 anyway, so I guess it's not really too bad. So if you're not that concerned about the software and you want something at least decently newer, then you're probably going to be at least okay with Android 12. Now, one disappointing thing about this phone is that unfortunately, with the BLU F92e 5G, we're not getting NFC. So if you like to use tap and pay, you are going to want to get something else because with this phone, of course, since it doesn't have NFC, that's not an option. And that's really disappointing because at this point in 2023, how many stores do you know of that don't have tap and pay? I mean, the feature is so popular and so many people have it that I feel like in 2023, every new smartphone, especially a 5G phone like this, should have NFC. And even if you don't use it now, who knows, maybe you might want to try it out in the future. If you have a phone like this that doesn't have NFC, then you won't even have the option. So whether you currently use tap and pay, or you don't now, but you might want to try it later, either way, I would definitely avoid this phone. But of course, if you're someone who doesn't use tap and pay, and you don't think you're ever going to want to, then I guess this won't be a big deal. Now, I want to give you an idea of what it's actually like to watch a video on this phone because I imagine in this day and age, that's something a lot of people are going to be doing. Samsung Galaxy A14 5G and going over pretty much everything I can think of about it to give you a better better idea of what you can expect if you get it. Now, as always, if you do end up wanting to learn more about it, definitely check out the description, where I will be linking to several other videos about it, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get right into it. Now, the Samsung Galaxy A14 so as you can see, when I cover the main speaker, you can't hear anything, because unfortunately this phone doesn't have stereo audio. Basically the same thing. And over the past year, the A13 5G did turn out to be a fairly popular device. Now with the it is decently loud though, I'll give it that. I have seen some big improvements from the A13 5G, and the best one by far is definitely the display. With this phone, we're getting a 6.6-inch 90Hz PLS LCD display with a real nice looking but in general, things do look at least decently good. Sure, if you're going to be watching videos all day, I would probably get something different just because, again, this phone only has a 720p resolution, and if you're doing stuff where the image quality really matters a lot, you probably are going to want something a bit better. And then when it comes to the audio, I'm really personally not a big fan. Again, it is at least decently loud, but not having stereo audio is definitely a disappointment, especially if you consume content a lot without wearing headphones. But then again, if you're someone who wears headphones all the time, then you probably will never even notice. But again, keep in mind, the speaker quality, because it doesn't have stereo audio, isn't really the best. But if you're just looking for something that's loud and you don't really care about having an immersive experience, then it should be at least okay. But in general, again, if you're watching the occasional video every now and then, I do think things will be at least okay with this phone. And if you're maybe like playing music on it from a distance and you're not really paying too much attention, maybe you just want some background noise or something, then in that case it probably will be okay audio wise. But of course, considering this is a really entry-level phone, if you are consuming a lot of content and you're really expecting a top quality experience, you might be a little disappointed. Now, taking a look at the overall design, I do think this phone looks decently nice. I mean, it's not really that unique. Again, for an entry-level phone, it has a pretty generic design with a slightly thicker bottom bezel, and then the water drop notch up top. So yeah, it's pretty normal, but I will say, the materials are really nice. The phone is decently slim, so it's not too bulky or anything. And even with the case, I do think it's going to be perfectly fine. The sides are made of aluminum, which I thought was pretty cool. The buttons and overall build quality feel pretty solid. And the back is also made of a frosted glass, or a matte glass, or whatever you want to call it. And it doesn't really pick up too many fingerprints. Granted, if you have a case on, which this phone does come with by the way, you really won't even notice, but at the same time, it never hurts to have really nice materials, and this phone also does have a good amount of weight to it. So regardless, if you are looking for a more entry-level device that does have clearly good build quality, then you won't be disappointed here. But in conclusion, my general thoughts about the BLU F92e 5G. Overall, for what it is, I do think this is a pretty decent phone. Sure, it doesn't really have that many distinguishing features, but one thing that really stands out to me is the storage. Getting a whole 128GB of internal storage at full price for like $149 is definitely impressive. And for other things like the display, the performance, the camera setup, and the battery, sure, it's not really the best in the world, and in this price range, you can really only expect so much anyway. But for the average user for more basic activities, it definitely will get the job done. Now, the two main drawbacks with this phone are, first of all, the software. Again, even though Android 12 isn't really that bad, it's kind of disappointing to get it when, again, we are on Android 13, so make of that what you will. If you don't really care, then it's obviously not a problem, but if you do, keep in mind, there are definitely better options out there. And then not having NFC, again, definitely disappointing here. For me personally, that's honestly a deal breaker because I use Tap and Pay for pretty much everything, but if you don't ever use Tap and Pay, then definitely not too big a deal. So in general, if you are looking for a really entry-level 5G phone for more basic activities, and you also want a ton of storage, then the BLU F92e 5G is definitely worth considering. Now once again, if you do end up wanting to learn more about this phone, definitely check out the description, where I am linking to several other videos about it, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipis Tech on Twitter and Instagram, and as always, I will see you in the next video.